Welcome back again. Let's talk some more about ecosystems and ecology. This is one of my favorite topics in biology because in no other place do you really get to see how incredibly complicated life systems are on Earth. That Romans 1:20 idea just permeates this all through because it's not just a chaotic mass of animals and plants like we might think. Everything has an exact place, an exact role, and that's in a fallen ecosystem. So imagine that. What would the world have been like, or what will it be like someday when God restores everything and redeems his creation, and we see everything in the plant and animal kingdom working exactly the way that he intended it to do in Eden? I look forward to that. This is a picture I took in Costa Rica once. And just looking at it, you can see several plants growing on a tree. The trees there, they say, actually have more things growing on the tree than there actually is tree itself. And I believe that because you look at this tree trunk, I made out 36 different plants on this one picture right here. You see some little bromeliad, those star-like things. You see mosses, lichens. The ones on the right are orchids. So imagine that, just it's teeming with life there, mainly because it's tropical and it gets plenty of rain, so you don't have to worry about freezing or anything like that. But a very natural and a very good place to be. I wanted to take this log home with me, but customs would have been very upset about that probably. The best I could do was tromp my feet all over it and pick up spores, which I did bring back. So the mud on my feet, I eventually poured onto a tray and kept it in a greenhouse for about a year and actually retrieved several of these plants here. It can be done. This is a water ecosystem in Arkansas, or is it water? Because look around. You can see an upper mountain ecosystem. You can see, obviously, an aquatic, that's what we call water, and just many different ecosystems there. But isn't that beautiful? Just a collection of ecosystems. And like I said, we'll see in a few minutes that every single thing there has a purpose and a role that it plays in this ecosystem. Here's another purely aquatic ecosystem. But do you see how they sort of blend together? Because if I were in the water, I would have one ecosystem that would be made of only things that would be in the water. And I could have another ecosystem that was a prairie ecosystem in the foreground or a forested ecosystem in the background. And they do connect with each other because can you think of some animals that may go both into the woods and into the water? Let's start with some terms that we'll use pretty often. When I use the word habitat for something, that's all it is a place that something would be expected to be. So if you were lost, let's say, and the police came and said, well, where would we most likely find your roommate or your friend? What would people say about it? What's your habitat? What's the place that you would most likely be expected to be? And that's what it is for animals and plants. They have a definite place. They don't just grow anywhere. They have a specific place or a habitat that they grow. On this picture, you see 5 arrows. Can you think of some birds that would live in each of these particular habitats? I'm thinking of the one in the ground right there. Can you think of a bird that you would expect to find underground? That's a hard one. We do have one bird here in northwest Arkansas. Elam Denham found one of these once. It's a pygmy owl, and it literally burrows under the ground, and that's where it stays most of the daytime. It comes out at night. What would you expect to find farther away from a tree, the middle arrow that you see? What kind of bird in particular would be in an open area and not necessarily a forested area? I'm thinking something like quail, meadowlarks, things like that tend to be in the prairie. But do you see the idea there that some things prefer to be in the prairie, some things would prefer to be in the forest? In fact, even in the forest, look what we have on the tree. There's a particular type of bird called a siskin that you only find, except in rare occasions, you only find it at the very bottom of a tree, just within the perimeter of the crown of the tree. And what they do, they typically just eat the things that birds and things up above are dislodging from the tree, and it falls to the ground, and they gobble it up. So that's their role in the ecosystem. They would never go out into the field. They would never go underground. They would never go up higher in the tree. They just stay around the bottom of it. Can you think of a bird that would stick vertically to the trunk of a tree? I'm thinking woodpeckers. They have perfect feet for that, 2 toes forward, 2 toes back, and that's what their lifestyle is. They can hang vertically on a tree trunk, and that's where you'll find most of the time woodpeckers. So we have flickers and pileated woodpeckers, all kinds of different woodpecker family birds around. But if you see one, occasionally you may see it sitting on the ground, but almost all the time you find it, it will be in its habitat, specifically on a tree trunk. Now, the one at the top of the tree, this is one of the most interesting birds I've seen. And actually, I've only seen it 3 or 4 times. It's a bird that you hear pretty often, but its habitat is the very top branches of a tree, and it hardly ever goes anywhere else. It will spend its life pretty much in the very tops of trees, and that's why we don't see it very often. It's called a red-eyed vireo. And it has a sound that sounds like, "Here I am, see me, come and get me." And it does that over and over, except without the words. It's more just the sounds. But yeah, you rarely see it. Occasionally it'll fly up and get an insect. It will build its nest in the top of the tree, have its babies in the top of the tree, and that's where you'll typically find it. Now here's another interesting word. When we use the word niche, or if we're actually accurately French using it, it's niche. But we're not. We're in Arkansas, so we'll call it a niche. The job for an organism, or the role that it plays. And sometimes this may sound like the habitat, but it's really not. It could sound like where the bird is, but it's usually, or the animal, but it's usually the job that it's doing. And that's an unusual concept, isn't it? You don't usually think of animals playing a role in nature, but they actually do. They're designed specifically to go in a particular place at a particular time and do a particular job. So here are some common niche names that we use pretty often. And you kind of get the idea. It's sort of, like we said, the job that something does. So a predator, something that would prey on other animals and eat them. An herbivore, something that would eat plants in an ecosystem. A scavenger. They sound gross, but we like those. We don't like dead animals laying around on the ground. So scavengers, their job, literally, if you want to call it a job, is to clean up dead animals on the ground. And of course, they're not thinking that. They're just doing what God designed them to do. But in the scheme of God's creation, that is their role, to actually clean up dead things and start decomposing them into something more usable by other things. And then usually after the scavenger gets finished with something, the decomposers will take over with all the other little bits and pieces that are left behind. So think of fungi and bacteria, things like that, that will come in and really start breaking down dead material or feces from different things. And then of course a producer, we'll see later, this is one of the most important parts of an ecosystem, because a producer is literally a photosynthetic plant. So something that can take energy from the sun and use it to put carbon dioxide and water together to make sugars. And remember, that's what we run on. Animals run on sugar. So that's a very important niche to have, something that can actually take the CO2 that you're breathing out and water and turn it into something that's a high energy glucose that can be used for something. But yeah, these are just jobs that an animal could do. And interestingly, here's the way it's going to work. Only one species ultimately will fill a specific niche in a specific time and habitat. So let's say here in Northwest Arkansas, if we had a particularly defined niche, and if we had 2 species of something that were trying to fill it, let's say that we accidentally brought in an invasive species that shouldn't be here, it will try to fit into a particular niche. And it's a battle at that point, because sometimes the natural animal that's there may lose out to the exotic one because there can only be one in the end that fills that niche. And that one will be the one that's the strongest or the slyest or whatever. But ultimately, one of them will go extinct and one will take over that particular niche. So thinking about squirrels here, we do have two particular species of squirrels. We have red squirrels or fox squirrels on the left and gray squirrels on the right. And fortunately, though, they've started in northwest Arkansas to occupy different niches, because we'll see later, gray squirrels typically stay closer to the ground around evergreen trees, and fox squirrels tend to go higher into oak and maple trees. So we thought for a while that they would be competing for the same niche, but it looks like they figured out a plan so that both of them have their own particular little job that they can do as far as a place that they're working. Now, check this out too. I'm going to take herbivore here, and we can really narrow this down and get more specific on it, because if we just said plant eater, that's what they do. But look at all the jobs that you can have plant eaters doing. And you don't have to write these down, but do you get the idea? You could have large grazing herbivores. You could have in a tree herbivore, in the open herbivore. So let's think about that. What would be in northwest Arkansas our large grazing herbivore? Yeah, white-tailed deer. That's the one we would expect to find. If you go a little farther west into Oklahoma, it should have been a bison. But since we killed the bisons out, nature doesn't like to have empty places. So what happened was the white-tailed deer started moving westward into Oklahoma. And if you go to Oklahoma now, you won't see very many bison because they've been killed off, but you will see lots of white-tailed deer, which shouldn't have been there in the original intent of the niche, but they're there because a niche has to be filled. That's another rule we'll say, that if a niche exists, something will eventually fill it, and only one thing will fill it. What kind of herbivore do you think would live in a forest tree almost completely? Not entirely. I mean, they're animals with brains, and so sometimes they break the rule and leave their niche temporarily. I'm thinking squirrel, like we just saw. So fox squirrels in particular would be in the very tops of oak trees, usually eating acorns. They may come down to the ground and eat acorns that have fallen off the tree if they get desperate. What about a mammal near a forest region, but it would be outside of the forest region? I don't know if you've noticed this, but this particular little mammal will almost always be away from a tree somewhere, not under a tree. And I'm thinking cottontail bunny rabbit. Yeah, they're kind of prairie animals or open space animals. We also have, look at this, nighttime seed eaters and daytime seed eaters. So we could have a niche defined by the time of day that it happens. And the daytime eaters will not compete with the nighttime eaters because they're not there at the same time. Or you could have burrowing herbivores or tree-dwelling herbivores or stealing from other herbivores. Everything has a specific, well-defined job that it actually does. And so, like I said, we tend to think just by looking at nature and walking down a trail that it's just a chaotic mass of trees and plants and animals just doing what they can to survive. But that's not true. God made a very orderly ecosystem. And as we said, even though it's a fallen ecosystem, it still is very, very organized and maintains its rules very, very proficiently most of the time. So here we are again. Here is our large grazing herbivore. You go a little bit west and it should be bison. We actually could reestablish those if we wanted, but I think the government and other people are leery of introducing a huge thing walking on the highway that, it's bad enough to hit a deer on a motorcycle, but to run into one of these would be a little bit problematic. So even though we could reintroduce these, and I think we probably should, there's a little bit of public dissension on that. Now, go up farther north, maybe into Canada, and look what you find. Yeah, mooses, or moose, or meese. So, depending on where you are, they fill the same part of the niche. They're herbivores that graze on plants, grazing herbivores, all basically in the same family, pretty much. until you go to Australia. And look at this. You've got the first three I showed you were ungulates or artiodacts that have horns, and they're all in the same family. But here we've got a kangaroo that's in a totally different class of animals even. It's a marsupial, but look at it. For all purposes, it's filling the niche of what a white-tailed deer would fill. In Australia, though, there are no white-tailed deer, so that's the animal that takes over that particular niche. And if you think about it, it acts very much like a deer or a bison or a cow or something. That's the niche that it's filling as a grazer on the open outback or wherever. Looking at these, which niche do you think we're talking about? Yeah, scavengers. You got vultures, hyenas in Africa, catfish, an aquatic scavenger that usually eats dead things on the bottom of a body of water. And we have fly maggots. We don't like to think about gross things like this, but in nature, those are incredibly useful because within the first few hours of something dying, a mother fly will deposit 100,000 eggs. And sometimes in the summertime, within 48 hours, the entire meat of that animal has been eaten up by maggots. So in nature, that's a good thing because the maggots are going to poop out high nitrate nutrients that other things, especially plants, are going to be using. And some things will actually eat the maggots. So again, it sounds gross to us, but in nature, that's a very useful and a very orderly way of doing things. We'll talk about this later. When you talk about how diverse a species is, species richness is the first term you come up with, and that's the number of species in a place. And then the relative abundance is how many of each species. So we could have species diversity, or we may think we have it, but we just don't have enough numbers of species, or we may not have enough of each species represented. And what we like in the natural world is hopefully have a balance of species diversity so that the ecosystem functions properly. And it's become a big thing. You know, we like ecosystems that are stable, and we'll see later some things that will make an ecosystem less stable than it could be. Yeah, so check out these two forest lists right here. What would you say about Forest A? Yeah, it has species diversity and number of species diversity. Forest B has less species diversity, but it does have a large number of at least one species. So which would be the most stable, do you think? Probably Forest A, because it has a better number of each one spread out in a more diverse way. We'll talk more about that later. Now, this is something that we'll see over and over too, but in an ecosystem, there is a definite flow of energy. And this is another thing that God has instituted in a fallen ecosystem. I'm not sure whether this would work in a perfect Edenic type society or ecosystem, but for now on planet Earth, if you watch History Channel or Animal Planet, this is what you see. A eats B, B eats C. So how would that work? If A were a plant and it was eaten by B, then that would be like a bunny rabbit eating grass, and then C could be a hawk that ate the bunny rabbit. So let's think about C there. Where did the hawk get the energy from that it just ate from the rabbit? Yeah, the rabbit got it from the plant. Where did the plant get it? From sunlight. And so do you see this perfect flow of energy and also chemicals? Because obviously C, the hawk, would have carbon because living things are made of carbon. Where did it get its carbon? From B, from what it ate. I mean, that's how we get chemicals, is by eating them. And so B got its carbon from A, and A got its carbon probably from carbon dioxide in the air. It's a producer or a plant. And this is something very obvious in ecosystems, and that's why we like diverse ecosystems with lots of things, because we have lots of choices for energy and chemicals to flow from one organism to another. What do you call it when energy or chemicals can't flow from one to the other? Starvation. Okay, so there's the sun shining on a plant. And that's pretty much the rule of planet Earth, isn't it? Because our energy, all energy, with the exception of maybe some nuclear power plants that are running greenhouses or something, maybe on a submarine or somewhere. But pretty much the energy on planet Earth is going to come from sunlight. And the sunlight will shine on a producer or a green plant. And we'll see later that's going to be called photosynthesis. So that's how energy gets into the system, always. And then we need other things, and most producers or plants will take a few chemicals from the soil. In fact, they will take nutrients, all of the nitrates, nitrites, things like that, minerals, and also water from the soil. That's why we water plants. What do you see going on here? If you said caterpillar, you just showed your bias, because when I looked at it once again, I see a milkweed plant because I'm a botanist. What kind of caterpillar is that? Do you recognize it? That's correct. It is a monarch butterfly caterpillar. So this time of year, Arkansas, Oklahoma, we're kind of the stopping off place before monarchs finally get to Canada. I'm sorry, South America. So they've left Canada this time of year and they're headed south towards South America, where they will keep the generations going. But one of their stopping off points to get enough energy to fly across the Gulf of Mexico is to stop here and lay their eggs on milkweed plants, and the caterpillar will eventually hatch out and the butterfly will fly on its continued way down to South America somewhere. Yeah, so do we have an ecosystem or a food chain here? You bet we do. We've got a producer and a consumer. So the most simple food chain we can imagine, or the simplest energy flow, because whatever that producer is making in terms of photosynthesis, that consumer is going to eat it and turn it into caterpillar body. So a producer and a consumer. Which one would you be? Yeah, unless you're green and photosynthetic and stand out in the sun to eat, you're probably a consumer. So we eat either plants or animals that have eaten a plant, which makes us a consumer. Now, let's add a little complexity to this. Let's add a robin. And by the way, robins really don't eat caterpillars, but let's say that they do. So the caterpillar eats the plant, the robin eats the caterpillar, and we still have a food chain. We now have two consumers. And that's why we call it a food chain. The energy just flows in a straight line from the producer to a consumer, and then something eats that consumer and gets the energy from that consumer. So you could safely say that robin got all of its energy from what it was eating, which probably was a caterpillar. The caterpillar got their energy from a plant. So essentially the robin now has plant energy indirectly. It had to go through a consumer to get that way. And if we wanted to get more technical, here's what we could do. We could specify primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, different types of consumers. So first level, second level, third level, and so on. What's the highest level that you are, do you think? What is can you trace something? If you had oatmeal for breakfast, or cornflakes, or pasta, or bread, you were a primary consumer. Did you eat another animal for breakfast? Yeah, if you ate pork or something, you ate a pig, which had eaten a plant, so that would put you at a secondary consumer. Has anyone ever eaten anything that would put you at a third level consumer? That means that you ate an animal that had eaten another animal that had eaten a plant. It is possible. If you're thinking mammals and you ever ate a bear, the bear probably could have eaten a smaller animal which ate a plant. I'm thinking more about fish, though. If you eat a bass, you're probably eating a fish that had eaten another fish that possibly had eaten an insect that had eaten an algae that had eaten a plant. So you could be way up in maybe the fifth level at some points here, especially with fish and aquatic type of producers and consumers. Now, we could also use some other Latin terminology here, and we're not changing anything. We're just looking from a different point of view. But a plant eater is called an herbivore. An animal eater is called a carnivore. Carne is meat. Herb is plant. So what are you, an herbivore or a carnivore, or perhaps both? There's a term for that too, an omnivore. So if you eat both plants and animals, you're considered an omni. Omni means everything or all around. Now, just to get even more technical, some scientists consider these trophic levels. Trophic just means eating. So the first eating level, I guess, is the plant eating sunlight. The second eating level, and so on. Third eating level. And these are just different ways of talking about how energy flows, different systems of using the words. Let's put this into real life then. I see a bird, a robin, and let's say it's the same robin and it's eating caterpillars. The caterpillars are eating plants. So do you see something going on here? More of a pyramid shape? Because the way it really works is that bird won't just eat one caterpillar in a year or its lifetime. It's going to eat a whole bunch of caterpillars. I mean, that just stands to reason. You don't get all the energy you need for a lifetime from eating one meal. So you eat a lot of meals, which means you waste a lot of energy at every level. So that bird is wasting energy, or the system is wasting energy. It's not perfect, not a perfect energy flow. But now let's think about every single caterpillar that was eaten by that bird. Every caterpillar probably had to eat a lot of plants. I have tomato plants that one single tomato caterpillar can completely eat one tomato plant in one nighttime. So caterpillars are voracious eaters. And that means if I think about that bird then, essentially that robin has probably eaten, 10, 15, 20 acres worth of plants in a lifetime, because it's eaten thousands and thousands of caterpillars in its lifetime. And each caterpillar easily could have eaten 4 or 5 square meters of plant material in an area. And that's why we worry sometimes about ecology and food chains, because what would happen if we come in and, let's do this first. Let's put a hawk onto this thing. So the hawk is going to eat robins. Do you think this food web that you see now, or food chains, could support a hawk? It's kind of questionable, isn't it? Because I see one robin there, and if that one robin or even 10 robins represented what was there, that's not really enough energy to support a hawk. So what would happen then if we started eliminating plant material? Or what about all those things that are really high up on the food chain, things that eat a lot of things under them? Do you see now why we don't have bears just stacked up every few feet apart in Rogers, or mountain lions or hawks, or even bass in a stream? You're not going to have a whole bunch of bass in a lake, because that one bass is going to eat thousands and thousands of smaller fish. Each of those smaller fish is going to eat literally thousands and thousands of even smaller fish. And every one of those tiny fish is probably going to eat millions of little insects in the water. So a lake just isn't big enough to have thousands and thousands of large bass in it, because it can't have things on the bottom of the pyramid. And that's why we worry about when we put in a housing development or something, people would say, well, we've just eliminated a few weeds in a field or a few trees. But look what's happening. If we eliminate the bottom, which are the plants, even though we don't think anything is happening, that means that something is not going to have enough plants to eat. Those caterpillars probably. And at some point, there will be so few caterpillars left that the bird may not have enough to eat. And once again, that's why we're concerned, and some people really argue and are, give radical ideas about the idea that we shouldn't destroy any parts of an ecosystem, because literally, as Rachel Carson says, you can't mess with one part without affecting every other part in some way. Yeah, so what just happened? We lost so many plants on the bottom, which meant we lost so many caterpillars that robin can't even exist there anymore. So she probably flies off somewhere else to find food. Let's try something else here. Let's put a copperhead in this mix. So I'm thinking a copperhead probably could eat caterpillars, but it also could eat birds. Birds can't eat copperheads though, so birds can still eat caterpillars. And look what we've just done. We now don't have a food chain anymore. We have what's called a food web. And that's a little bit more stable. Ecologists like this idea, because do you sort of see what would happen if the bird disappeared? you still would have a food chain because the snake would eat the caterpillars eat the plants. What would happen if the snake disappeared? You still have a food chain. The robin can still eat the caterpillar. So that's good. An animal could possibly go extinct, and we don't like that, but at least the ecosystem wouldn't fall apart if one of the constituents of it went extinct in some way. That's what we like to do on planet Earth. We like diverse ecosystems with lots of different connections between animals and plants. That's considered much more healthy because you don't have the risk of something going completely extinct and the whole food chain just completely break down. Yeah, here's a simple food chain with its trophic levels here. And you sort of see what I was saying. If the plants disappeared, there would be no mice, and then there would be no snakes, and there would be no eagles. If the eagle disappeared, though, think what happens when you go backwards. Now the snakes are going to extremely overpopulate, and they're going to eat so many rats that the rats go extinct, and now the plants overpopulate. And so now everything overpopulates and probably starves to death now just because the top of it, the eagle, disappeared. That's why we're so concerned with birds of prey, because a bird of prey in an area, if you have a hawk or an eagle living on your property, it probably has to have about 100 acres to supply it with enough food to eat. And we're talking about the plants on the area that are eaten by the mice, that are eaten by the snake, that are eaten by the eagle. And that's why the federal government put such a stiff penalty, $20,000, I believe, for shooting an eagle or a hawk, and jail time, because they realize you're really messing up the food chain and the trophic levels if you kill a top, they call it an apex predator on the top of it. So apex predators are very well regulated. They are super important in a food web or a food chain. Now, look how complicated this is. A typical Rogers will say forest. Man, look at the animals and look at the different pathways, because each pathway shows what each of these animals could eat. And you see they have several choices on what to eat. And that's a good, stable ecosystem. We could eliminate the ringtail, let's say, and that still wouldn't mess up the ecosystem. It would have an effect, but it wouldn't destroy it because the lines would just have to shift to something else. And once again, that's why we sort of get upset when we talk about animal extinction, because the more extinction we have, the less diverse these food chains and food webs get. And eventually we push it to the point that it will fail completely if we eliminate too many species in this particular web. So yeah, here's an illustration. A is a simple food chain. B is a food web. But B is much more stable. That's what we want. We want stability. We want species diversity, species numbers up. And that means you don't have to sit around wondering, oh, is it going to fail someday because we've lost one link in the chain, which is going to mess everything up. Just thought I'd throw this in. Yeah, that's what you are, a dirt man. Thanks to Genesis. Now, let's think about a related aspect of this. The idea that we've touched on before, that planet Earth, according to Rachel Carson, that is all we've got. So whatever resources that are there, we have to reuse them. If we mined all the iron out of the ground and never use it again, we would eventually run out of iron, because it's not a renewable resource. There's a finite amount of iron, copper, things like that in the ground. So you sort of see then why we need to think about recycling or reusing. This really didn't come up very much when I was a kid, because we were still less populated on Earth. And yeah, people like Rachel Carson were talking about it, but for the most part, people didn't think about reusing things, except during World War II when things were scarce. But other than that, you would just read a paper and throw it away, throw it in the trash, burn it or something, instead of thinking, this used to be a tree, and if I keep doing this, I'm going to eliminate more and more trees. Now, on the good point here, a tree is what's called a renewable resource. So at least with a tree, we can grow more of them and more of them and more of them. But we still have the problem, what happens when all the nutrients in the soil from the growing trees have been used up? So it still is a problem. It's just a little bit delayed problem. But it emphasizes again the fact that Earth is all we have right now. We're not even on the verge of thinking maybe someday we can go and mine things from other planets. That's not even on the horizon right now. So unless we reused what is there and keep recycling it, and I think your generation, it's really going to come to play with you, because things will be getting scarcer and scarcer. And by the time you're adults, and I don't see this as a terrible problem, but you're going to have to make decisions that say, yeah, I think it's better to recycle. And I think it'll be a monetary decision, because I believe hauling your trash off is going to be more expensive, and materials are going to be more expensive unless you can recycle it, because it's much cheaper to melt down a bottle or a can than it is to go and mine the stuff out of the ground and have to recreate it all. The circle of life. Sorry, just had to put that in. But that's what it's about, isn't it? Not really a spiritual thing at this sense, as in The Lion King, but more of the idea that all we have is all we have on planet Earth as far as the physical resources, and we better take care of it. So let's look at this then. What things do you absolutely have to recycle that now, as of today, are crucial, critical things that we better start thinking about? And this is why we have ecology and environmental science, because we can do things with these big four things. So let's look at this. For example, nitrogen. We've already talked about that. And if you think of an amino acid, picture that in your head once again. Remember, on one end of it, it had an amine group. That amine group had a nitrogen atom in it. So to make protein, you have to have at least that one nitrogen. You can't make an amino acid without a nitrogen. So those obviously have to be recycled. There's a limited amount of nitrogen in the soil. And by nitrogen, we usually talk about the nitrogen form that plants need, such as an NH3 or an NO3. Those are called nitrates or ammoniums or something. So don't be confused. If I use the word nitrogen, I'm not just talking about the atom nitrogen. I'm talking about a compound that probably has nitrogen in it that we're using for something. But here's the way it works. It is possible, every time it lightnings, there's enough energy in that million volt bolt of electricity to literally take the nitrogen from the air, which is N2. And by the way, you can't eat N2, and plants can't eat N2, and nothing can. It's just a gas floating around in the atmosphere that is there with oxygen. In fact, 70-something% of the atmosphere is N2 nitrogen. But lightning puts enough energy into that N2 that it can combine with an O3 to make something a plant can use, a nitrate. And that's fertilizer. So obviously, if you're going to have producers or plants growing, you have to have fertilizer, and that's the number one fertilizer that most plants are deficient of right now. So nitrates are incredibly important in the environment. Also, here's another small way they can get in the soil. There are particular plants in the legume family or the bean family. So if you think of anything that has a pod on it, like a bean or a pea or mimosa tree or alfalfa or something like that, anything that literally has its seeds in a pod has bacteria in its roots that can change into NO3. Isn't that amazing? So that's why some farmers prefer growing peas or alfalfa as a cover crop, because if you grow corn and watermelons all the time, you're eventually taking all the nitrates out of the soil and sending them along with your corn and watermelon somewhere else, and your soil will be depleted of nitrates. So unless you had lightning striking and nitrogen fixing bacteria in legume plants, you would eventually end up with zero nitrate. Okay, the bad news is legume plants and lightning can only do a little bit of N2 conversion. We need something much more powerful and more stable than these two things, even though they help. About 10% of nitrates probably come from these two. So let's do it a different way. why don't we look at what's really happening? So those nitrates obviously are going to be soaked up into a tree through the root system, and they're going to be used to make the plant. That's what living things are made of, remember, proteins. And so the nitrate from that NO3 will join some other constituents in the plant like CO2 and water and stuff and turn into amino acids, which eventually will turn into proteins. Okay, in this picture, that caterpillar is going to be eating the protein. That's one reason they eat, to get carbohydrates and protein. So it'll probably get some sugars, but it will definitely get some proteins from it as well. But do you see, we didn't destroy any of the nitrogen. We just passed it from the ground up to the plant, up to the caterpillar. So the nitrogen is still there. It wasn't destroyed. It still is hanging around. So if that animal now dies, or if that animal poops out waste material, we can be pretty sure that it's going to be rich in nitrates because that's what it's taking in most of the time. And that's why we like the idea of composting, because a dead plant or a dead animal or waste material is already full of nitrates. And if we can get that back into the soil, we've got it made. We've got a circle of life again, because the living plants grow, they die, nitrates go back to the soil again. Now, in a natural system, that works very well, doesn't it? Because in nature, a tree dies, falls to the forest, an animal dies, falls to the forest floor. Eventually, decomposers like bacteria and fungi will break it down into nitrates again. So where do we get into trouble with this? Yeah, when we take those away and keep them in a place that they can't be used. For example, all of those dead leaf clippings and grass clippings from your yard every year, it would be good if they could just sit on the ground somewhere and rot and turn back into nitrates. Unfortunately, in urban areas, we don't like big piles of leaves laying in your yard. So we take grass clippings, leaves, stick them in plastic bags, and have the sanitation people bury them 200 feet underground. And, you know, that's not a good thing in the general scheme of things. It helps the homeowner because it keeps your lawn and your lot looking pretty. But at the same time, you now have put those nitrates so far underground that it may be thousands of years before the ground erodes down to get those nitrates again. So you see the problem there. We need those nitrates. It would be much better to compost and then put those nitrates back into usable soil somewhere than it would be just to bury them underground. And there's another part of this circle. Some of those soil nitrates will break down into N2 and go back into the atmosphere again. So here's the complete picture. That's what a natural forest or field would look like. And again, our problem is we tend to take nitrates and put them into places that they can't be used anymore. About 55% of Roger's trash pickup is from leaves and grass clippings. So imagine what a difference we could make if somehow we could not do that, and homeowners could save on their sanitation bill because they're paying over half of it just to take care of leaves and grass, which could easily be put somewhere where a farmer could use it. Now, that's going to take time and effort, and I think that's the problem. Most people aren't willing to say, well, I can't do it alone, so unless everybody does it at once, what good is one person? And that's true until we have rules or something that would let everyone work together on this. And as you've probably heard, I'm not in favor of government mandated laws and rules very much. So what I would prefer is, and what I think is going to happen is, trash pickup will eventually get so expensive that your family may have to decide, I can't pay $20 a bag to have my trash picked up. I think I'm going to take my lawn clippings and leaves and either take them to a composting plant, or I'm going to pile them in my backyard and let them rot and then spread them over my yard. So I hope it comes to that, rather than the government saying we're just going to stop picking up all garbage whatsoever, or we're going to fine you for having leaves in your garbage, something like that. The other thing we have to conserve and pass along is carbon. Now, this is a little easier than the other one because remember, carbohydrates are sugars basically. So when we eat one of these, we're naturally going to breathe out CO2. That's the form that carbon takes when we use it as a waste material. So there it goes. And look what happens when we breathe off CO2 into the atmosphere. Plants actually need CO2. So what a wonderful world we live in. The plants are needing what we breathe off. And let's get even better. We need what the plants are giving off. So the plants are going to make sugars, and we could either eat the plant, or an animal could eat the plant and then we eat the animal, or another animal eat that animal and then we eat that animal. So either way, carbon is easier to cycle, I think. We don't worry as much about that as we do nitrates. But it definitely does cycle. And we don't do ourselves a favor if we put carbon waste products in a dump or a landfill. We put those in places that they can't ever be used again for any purpose. And we just mentioned oxygen, because along with the carbon, we're also putting a circle or a cycle on oxygen. And we know we have to have oxygen. You've got to have it. Living things need oxygen. So it's pretty simple. We just said plants take in CO2, they give off oxygen. Animals give off CO2 and take in oxygen. And as long as everything is in balance, it's a perfect little ecosystem out there. We get about 80% of our oxygen from ocean algae, though. So when you look at a tree or grass or something, even all over the world, every jungle, field, prairie, we're only getting about 20% of our oxygen need from that. Animals are. So that's why we take care of oceans, because if the ocean algae ever disappears, we've lost the majority of the oxygen creating ability on planet Earth. And another thing, we'll finish with this, is just water. Water is interesting too, isn't it? Because we know we can evaporate it and reuse it. So look what water does. This is a simple diagram. Let's start on the right. You have a water on the surface or sweat on your arm or something. It just evaporates and goes back up into the air. And the good news is only the H2O goes back up. So even if you're sweating, going to the bathroom, evaporating, it's just H2O. It's nothing fancy, no contaminants, no gross stuff, just pure water. And then eventually, weather conditions are going to make the clouds or whatever forms precipitate the water back to the earth again. Some of it will percolate down to a place we call the aquifer. That's why we can dig a well and get to that water, because there's a layer of water under the ground that is there that we have access to. Or sometimes here in Rogers, it runs into Beaver Lake, and we get our water from that system rather than digging a well. Either way, though, do you see how neat this is? We're not going to run out of water. The problem, though, is going to be, will it be water at the right place at the right time that's not contaminated with something? So the problem is, what if that runoff picks up contaminants on the way down? Or what if the aquifer doesn't replenish because we build so many sidewalks and parking lots that water can't percolate? And that would become problematic. We'll continue this again later. Thank you.